Someone wrote to me recently. No name, just a story. I checked the details as best I could, and I decided to tell you. The girl asked me to change the names and the place. Everything else is the truth, her truth. There are places in this world that tourists never reach. Places where paved roads don't go, where normal internet doesn't exist, where mobile signal is a luxury, not a given. Places that don't appear in travel guides, places that no one films beautiful videos about. One of those places is a small village called Mordychi. It sits at the very foot of the Carpathian Mountains, in that part of Eastern Europe where the mountains never became popular resorts, where they stayed exactly as they always were, wild, heavy, alive. Where the forest begins right behind the garden fences and climbs the slopes so far that even local hunters don't know where it ends. Where fog rolls down from the peaks at night, so thick, so dense, that you can't see your own hand 2 steps in front of you. Where mountain streams run so cold that the water burns your skin even in the height of summer. Crystal clear, transparent down to the last pebble on the bottom. Ice-cold water that runs down from the peaks over rocks and never has time to warm up. In the mornings, the valley holds a silence so deep you can hear the dew dripping from the leaves. In the evenings, the sky above the ridges turns crimson, gold, impossibly beautiful. The kind of sky that doesn't exist in cities, and never will. Mordychi is a few dozen houses scattered across a small valley between 2 mountain ridges. Old houses, wooden, with carved shutters and low fences. Vegetable gardens, apple and plum orchards. Wells with wooden cranes. The smell of smoke and freshly cut grass hanging over the village all day long, mixed with the scent of pine and mountain wind. In the mornings, roosters and cows. In the evenings, silence. The kind of silence a city person finds unsettling at first, because they're used to constant background noise. There is no background noise here. There is only forest, mountains, wind, and that's all. The people here live the way their grandparents and great-grandparents lived. They know every stone in the area, every path, every tree at the edge of the village. And they know very well where you can go and where it's better not to go at all. At the northern edge of Mordychi, where the valley narrows and the mountains press in close, the forest begins. Not the kind of forest with mushroom clearings and squirrel trails, a different forest. Old, so old that the trees have stood for 200, 300 years. Enormous, dark, with roots like tentacles that crawl out of the earth and back into it again. A forest where it's dark as dusk, even in the middle of the day, because the canopy closes so tightly above your head that sunlight barely passes through. A forest that is always damp, always smelling of moss, mushrooms, and something else, something hard to describe, something ancient and untouched. The locals call it simply the Black Forest. And they don't go there. Never. The boundary between allowed and forbidden is marked simply. Old wooden posts with signs. Rusty barbed wire stretched between them. The signs have faded almost to white. The letters are barely readable, but the meaning is clear to everyone. Without words, no entry. Why no entry? That's a different question. Some talk about quicksand bogs beyond the forest. Fall in and you won't get out. Others mention old military installations, something buried there, something dangerous, better not to go near. The third kind, just look at you and say nothing. And in that silence, there is more of an answer than in any words. People disappeared in Mordychi. Everyone knew this. Not often, not every year, but they disappeared. They walked toward the Black Forest and didn't come back. Sometimes things were found. A mushroom basket left right at the boundary. A jacket hung neatly on one of the posts. Once, a child's boot. One boot, no pair, no tracks. Just a boot in the grass, 2 steps from the wire, as if a child had taken it off before stepping across. Bodies were never found. Never. That's everything you need to know about Mordychi before this story begins. Bozhena grew up in a city, a big one, noisy, with traffic jams and shopping centers, coffee shops on every corner, the constant hum of streets outside the window, the orange glow of streetlights through the curtains that never fully disappears, even at 3 in the morning. She grew up with all of this and thought it was normal. But every summer, from her earliest childhood, everything changed. Every summer, she got on a bus, then a minivan, then walked the last few kilometers down a dirt road, and arrived in Mordychi, to her grandmother. It was a tradition, almost a ritual. July or August, 2 or 3 weeks of quiet, away from the city, away from university, away from all that noise. Bozhena loved these trips. She loved the smell of that house, old wood and herbs drying in bunches under the ceiling, the smell of fresh bread baked in the oven every morning, the smell of something else, something intangible that existed only here and nowhere else, the smell of childhood. She loved waking up early, when the fog still lay thick in the valley, and the mountains were barely visible through it, gray, ghostly silhouettes. She loved stepping out onto the porch in those early hours, when the dew hadn't yet left the grass, and the air was so clean and cold that every breath felt like drinking spring water. She loved walking to the mountain river, crystal clear, so cold your teeth ached from just touching the water with your palm. She loved sitting on a stone at the bank and watching the water run over the river rocks. Fast, joyful, never stopping for a second. And she loved the evenings most of all, when the sun set and the sky above the mountains turned crimson, scarlet, impossibly beautiful. That year, Bozhena arrived at the end of July, but for the first time in all those years, not alone. She brought Pavlina, her university friend, someone she'd known since her first year. They'd been inseparable ever since, despite being completely different people. Maybe because of it. Sometimes opposites hold on to each other more tightly than people who are alike. Pavlina was the kind of person who found it boring to sit still for more than 5 minutes. Loud, impulsive, laughing before she'd even understood the joke. The kind who jumps into a cold river before thinking about the temperature of the water, and then screams with joy. The kind who says, "Come on, let's go, what's the big deal?" and is already walking, not looking back. A Pavlina's boyfriend came with her, Mikhey. Tall, solidly built, with a mop of light curly hair that stuck out in every direction, the way young people wear it now, carelessly, a little messy, but with its own character. He always smiled, not the polite smile people put on for photos, a real one, the kind that appears by itself when a person is genuinely happy. Mikhey was the practical type. He always carried a rucksack with a room for a torch, a folding knife, a map, snacks for a long walk, and a dozen other things that might come in useful, or might not, but better to have them just in case. From those people who call themselves practical, but really just love adventure. Grandmother welcomed all 3 of them warmly, set the table, made tea with raspberry jam, showed them the rooms. Pavlina immediately fell in love with the village. She ran around the garden, photographed the mountains, breathed the air as though she'd never been outside before. Mikhey helped grandmother chop firewood without being asked. In the evening, they all sat on the porch and watched the sky darken above the ridges. Everything was good. Everything was quiet. The first 2 days passed calmly. They went to the river, swam. Mikhey stayed in the ice-cold water longest of all, and came out blue but happy. They climbed the slope above the village, where the whole valley opened up below them, emerald green, flooded with sunlight, little houses of Mordychi far below, endless dark green forest all around. In the evenings, grandmother told stories about the village, the mountains, the old days, the old people who were no longer here. She never mentioned the Black Forest, not once, not a word. But one evening, Pavlina, who had already explored every corner of the village, asked at dinner about the posts with wire at the northern edge. Why the signs? What it meant? Grandmother went quiet. Just for a second. A small, almost imperceptible second. Then she answered calmly and briefly that it wasn't worth going there, that it was a dangerous place, that there had been accidents. Better to keep away. And she immediately changed the subject, asked if anyone wanted more tea, whether someone might want pie. Bozhena looked at Pavlina in that moment and felt that cold premonition in her chest. She knew her friend too well. She saw what happened in Pavlina's eyes the moment the word forbidden was spoken. Something lit up, came alive. For Pavlina, any prohibition worked not as a warning, but as an invitation. The word no acted on her like a red flag in front of a bull. Bozhena knew this, and she said nothing. She just filed it away. The kind of thing that troubles you, but that you have nothing to say against yet. On the third day, it rained from morning. A fine, quiet, Carpathian rain. The kind where an umbrella isn't necessary, but you're soaked through within an hour. They stayed inside, drank a lot of tea, watched the gray mountains through the window in comfortable silence. By noon, the rain began to ease. By 1 o'clock, the sky to the west had lightened, and around 2 o'clock, the sun came out. The wet grass sparkled. The mountains on the horizon became sharp and clear, as though someone had adjusted the focus. The air after rain was extraordinary, clean, cool, full of the scent of wet pine, pressed earth, moss, the kind of scent that exists only after a summer rain in the mountains. That was the moment Pavlina remembered the mushrooms. She said it the way people say something obvious. After rain like this, the forest must be absolutely full of them. That they should go, fill a basket, come back for dinner, ask grandmother to fry them with potatoes. Mikhey said immediately that this was an excellent idea. Bozhena looked at the clock. Just past 2. Until evening, at least 4 hours. Plenty of time. She agreed, but said immediately, only in the part of the forest grandmother said was safe, no further. Pavlina nodded, easily, willingly, almost without thinking. And that ease, that willingness, should have been a warning. But Bozhena chose to trust that nod. She would think about that decision many times afterward. Grandmother was out, had gone to a neighbor, said she'd be back for dinner. They got ready quickly, took baskets, one each, woven, with a wooden handle, put on rubber boots, jackets, because in the mountains the air cools fast after rain. Mikhey threw his rucksack over his shoulder as always, and they went. The forest met them with dampness and quiet. Not an unpleasant quiet, the right kind, forest quiet. Drops still fell from the branches, slowly, one by one. The wet moss underfoot gave with a soft spring. Between the trees, light strips of mist hung, remnants of cloud that had caught on the lower branches. It smelled of mushrooms, clearly, promisingly. But the mushrooms weren't there. Or rather, they appeared, but rarely. Small, not worth picking. They spread out, came back together, spread out again. An hour passed. The baskets were still nearly empty. Bozhena had a few slippery jacks. Pavlina had a couple of saffron caps. Mikhey, nothing worth mentioning. Pavlina muttered that the mushrooms had hidden themselves on purpose. Bozhena walked and tried not to think about the fact that they were moving gradually, step by step, toward the northern edge of the forest. But that was exactly where they ended up. As if the forest itself had been quietly leading them there all along. The barbed wire appeared between the trees without warning, rusty, sagging in places, stretched between old posts with faded signs. Pavlina reached the wire first and stopped. She looked at the wire in silence, then beyond it, then at Mikhey. And in her eyes lit that same fire Bozhena had seen 2 evenings ago at dinner. Beyond the wire, literally just a few meters away, mushroom caps peeked through the leaves and wet grass. Many of them, very many. Saffron caps in clusters, whole clusters, one after another. Perfect. White mushrooms, dense and firm, with brown caps. Red-capped boletes with bright tops visible even from here. Everything they'd been searching for on this side for over an hour. Right there, in abundance, untouched, as though no one had ever set foot there. Pavlina turned to Bozhena and asked why this place was fenced off. Bozhena answered honestly that you couldn't go there, that grandmother had said so, that people had disappeared there. Maybe bogs, maybe something else. Just you can't, and that should be enough. Pavlina listened carefully and nodded, then said there were clearly no bogs. Look, it's just forest. Everything's fine. That it was probably just old superstitions. That they'd go literally 10 meters in, pick mushrooms, and come straight back. Mikhey had already found a place where the wire sagged especially low, almost to the ground. Pavlina's eyes brightened even more. Bozhena looked at her friend. She knew it was pointless to argue. She saw those eyes, burning, decided before a single word had been spoken. For Pavlina, the conversation had been over before it began. She was already there, beyond the wire, in her mind. The body just needed to catch up. Mikhey climbed over first, in one easy movement, held out his hand to Pavlina. She stepped across. They both looked at Bozhena, and she, without knowing why, unable to explain it even now, stepped after them. They crossed the wire. First Mikhey, then Pavlina, then Bozhena, last, with the feeling of doing something irreversible. The first few steps, nothing changed. The same forest, same trees, same moss underfoot. The mushrooms were right there, exactly as Pavlina had promised. The baskets began to fill quickly. But then, something started to change. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, like someone turning an invisible dial very carefully. The air became different, a little sweeter, a little denser, with an unfamiliar scent that couldn't be compared to anything. Not unpleasant, on the contrary, almost pleasant, almost intoxicating, like the smell of flowers that don't exist. The colors around them became more saturated, the grass greener than grass can be in nature. The sky, when Bozhena looked up through the branches, seemed bluer and deeper than it should be. The moss on the trees almost glowed from within, a living, deep, emerald light. The birds sang, but not the way they sang on the other side of the wire, differently, more beautifully, almost too beautifully, as though the forest wanted to make a good impression, as though it was luring them in. Pavlina stopped, looked around, and said quietly that she couldn't understand why anyone would fence this place off, that it was stunning here, that she could stay here forever. Mikhey laughed and agreed. Bozhena said nothing and listened to the forest. She felt its beauty, felt it sharply, almost painfully. But something in her didn't trust that beauty. Something small and quiet said that beauty like this doesn't happen for no reason. They gradually spread out without noticing it. Mikhey moved slightly ahead. Pavlina went right. Bozhena tried to stay close to where they'd entered. She kept looking back, searching for the wire between the trees. First, it was visible, a thin gray thread between the trunks. Then, barely visible. Then, gone. She didn't know how much time had passed. It felt like 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. She thought about mushrooms, about grandmother's happy face, about how good it would be to sit at the table that evening. She didn't look at her watch. Afterward, she often thought about that. Why didn't she look at her watch the moment they crossed the line? At some point, she raised her head and realized she couldn't see Mikhey or Pavlina. She called out to Pavlina. Pavlina answered from somewhere to the right, and they found each other quickly. But Mikhey wasn't there. They called him, first quietly, then at full volume, then really loudly, turning in every direction. The forest swallowed their voices and gave nothing back. Mikhey didn't answer. Pavlina thought at first he was hiding, playing a joke on them. She called his name and laughed, nervously, a little forced, then stopped laughing. They walked back and forth, shouted, listened. Nothing. The forest was silent. Finally, Bozhena said they needed to go back to the wire, get to the other side, call for people. Maybe Mikhey was already there. Pavlina agreed, silently, with a short nod. Her face was paler than usual. They walked toward where they'd come from, or so they thought. Walked confidently. 10 meters, 20, 50. No wire. They went left. Nothing. Right. Nothing. Turned around and went back. Still nothing. The forest around them was identical everywhere. Same trees, same grass, same moss, same birds. No landmarks, no sign of where they'd entered. The sun. Bozhena looked up. The sun was in the wrong place. Too low. As though it was already evening. But they'd come in around 2 o'clock. And so little time had passed. Or so it seemed. She finally looked at her watch. 8:30 in the evening. She looked again. Blinked. Looked once more. 8:30. They'd come in around 2. More than 6 hours had passed. 6 hours, and it had felt like half an hour at most. Bozhena's hands went cold. She didn't tell Pavlina what time it was. She simply couldn't say it out loud. She just took Pavlina's hand and said they needed to find a way out, right now. They kept searching. For a long time. A long time is putting it mildly. By feel, another 2 hours, maybe more. They called for Mikhey, called to each other when they accidentally drifted a few steps apart, tried to walk in one fixed direction by the sun while it lasted, then by stars, but the canopy covered almost all of the sky above them. It got truly dark. In this forest, darkness was different from city darkness. Not the kind where there's always some light from street lamps or windows. Real darkness. Dense. Living. They turned on the torch function on their phones, but it gave almost nothing. A circle of light about 1 meter across. And around that, nothing at all. Pavlina held herself together, better than Bozhena had expected. She didn't scream, didn't fall apart, only sometimes said Mikhey's name quietly, almost to herself, like a prayer, like something you repeat when there's nothing else left to hold on to. At some point, they came out to a stream. Small, you could jump across it, but fast, mountain, with cold black water. Large flat stones along the bank. They sat down. Bozhena said they should stop, that they were tired, that it was dark, that in the dark they could go even further the wrong way. Pavlina said people would be looking for them. Bozhena said yes, they would, that they needed to give them a chance to find them, that if they kept wandering, it would be harder. They sat on the stones, ate whatever was in their pockets, a couple of sweets, a piece of bread wrapped in paper, drank water from the stream, scooping it up in their palms. Cold, so cold it made your teeth ache, but clean and good. The forest around them was alive, rustling, cracking, breathing, The daytime birds had gone quiet. Night birds, completely different ones, called out occasionally from somewhere high above. Somewhere in the distance, far away, very far, something large moved through the bushes. Mikhey? No, too heavy. An animal. Pavlina asked quietly whether she thought he was okay. Bozhena said he was smart, that he wouldn't panic, that he'd stop and wait. She wasn't sure of that herself, but it was what needed to be said. Some time passed. They almost dozed off, sitting up, leaning against each other. The cold kept them from sleeping properly, but exhaustion did its work. Then Pavlina touched her arm. Bozhena opened her eyes. On the other bank of the stream, deep in the forest, there was light. Not bright, dim, yellow, flickering, like a candle or a kerosene lamp. A hunter whispered. Maybe, said Bozhena. Let's go, said Pavlina. They crossed the stream on the stones, slowly, carefully, trying not to fall into the ice-cold water. Got to the other side, went into the forest toward the light. The light didn't disappear. It just shone steadily from one spot. They walked toward it. They didn't see it at first. First, a dark mass between the trees that wasn't trees. Then, moving closer, a shape, a roof, walls, a window with a dim light trembling inside, a house, wooden, old, sunk so deep into the ground it looked like it had stood there not for decades, but for centuries. The logs had gone black from time and moisture. The roof had sagged on one side. Thick moss covered the walls almost up to the windows, wet, vivid green, even in the dark of night. Grass grew knee-high at the threshold. The small window glowed from inside with an uneven yellow light. Someone lives here, said Pavlina quietly. They approached the door. Wooden, dark with age. An iron latch instead of a handle. Bozhena knocked 3 times quietly. Silence. She knocked louder. Silence again. Pavlina took hold of the latch and pulled. The door opened. The smell hit immediately. Heavy, damp, like a cellar that hadn't been opened in years. Marsh dampness, rot, something stale and dark. Not a sharp smell, just a very old one. The smell of a place where there had been no living air for a very long time. They held their breath for a moment, then stepped inside. Inside, it was dark. The light they'd seen from outside was there, but weak, barely there. Something like a kerosene lamp turned down to almost nothing, sitting on a shelf by the wall. A large room, A low ceiling with blackened beams. Wooden floor, warped, with wide gaps between the boards. Against one wall, an enormous old bed with carved posts. Against the other, a tall, dark wardrobe reaching almost to the ceiling. A table by the window. Nothing else. No photographs. No dishes on the table. No clothing. None of the small things that exist in any home where people live. Empty. As though the house had never lived in, or as though everything had been taken away long ago. Very long ago. "Is anyone here?" said Pavlina into the darkness. Silence. They entered. Carefully. One step at a time. The boards creaked underfoot. Each step rang out through the whole house. Bozhena looked around. Something about this house was wrong. Not just old and abandoned. Something else. Something she couldn't name yet. Pavlina, of course, didn't stand still. She opened the wardrobe. Empty. Ran her hand along the shelf above the lamp. Empty. Looked under the table. Then stopped in the middle of the room and looked down at the gap between the floorboards. The gap was wide. 3 fingers. From it came something damp and cold, like from a cellar below. "There's something down there," Pavlina whispered. "Look, there's a handle." In the floor there was a hatch cover, almost invisible, dark wood in dark floor, an iron ring. Pavlina reached for it. "Don't," said Bozhena. But Pavlina was already pulling. The cover lifted slightly, and from below came something that made Bozhena's breath catch. Dampness, cold, and something else. Something that made her stomach clench. Pavlina shone her phone torch into the gap and screamed. A short scream. She immediately clapped her hand over her own mouth. Whatever was down there had no business being in any normal place. Pavlina jumped back from the hatch, shook her head. Her eyes were enormous. "What's down there?" Bozhena whispered. Pavlina just shook her head. She couldn't speak, and she never told anyone, not then, not after, not ever. They were standing in the middle of the room when footsteps sounded from outside, slow, heavy, on the porch steps. They had a second, maybe 2. Pavlina threw herself at the wardrobe, Bozhena behind her. They climbed in, pulled the door shut. Inside, it was dark and cramped. It smelled of old wood and dust. They pressed against each other and went completely still. The front door opened. Footsteps entered. Slow, uneven, as though whoever was coming in was moving with difficulty, or deliberately slowly. The boards creaked under every step. Then a sound, something clicked, and the light in the room became slightly brighter. Not much, but enough to see part of the room through the cracks in the wardrobe doors. Bozhena pressed her eye to a crack. What she saw, she struggled afterward to describe accurately. Not because she didn't remember. She remembered very well, down to the smallest detail. The words just didn't fit. It was an old woman, very old as a person can be, small, hunched, dressed in dark clothing that hung on her like a sack, hair, white, long, tangled, hanging down on both sides of her face. Her face was not the face of a living person. Skin, gray, almost transparent, in deep wrinkles like the bark of a very old tree. A hooked nose, long. Hands, thin, with knotted joints, with fingernails so long they curved. She stood in the middle of the room and sniffed the air. That's exactly what she did, sniffed. Her head turned slowly from side to side. Her nostrils moved, like an animal that had caught the scent of something foreign. Then her gaze stopped on the wardrobe. For a second, just 1 second. But to Bozhena it felt like a lifetime. Then the old woman turned away. She opened the hatch cover and disappeared below. Pavlina grabbed Bozhena's hand hard, painfully. Neither of them breathed. From below came sounds. First, movement, rustling. Then, the creak of something wooden. Then, footsteps. But not alone. There were 2 of them. The old woman came up first, and behind her, Mikhey. No, not Mikhey, the one who looked like Mikhey. The same tall figure. The same light curly hair, but disheveled, matted, stripped of all its lively quality. He walked hunched over, barely lifting his feet, shuffling. His face was turned down. Bozhena couldn't see it at first. Then he turned. Pavlina, beside her, silently gasped. Mikhey's face was gray, sunken, dark circles under his eyes like hollows, skin dry, with patches, as though something was draining it from within. Eyes open, but empty. Not the emptiness of sleep, a different emptiness, as though there was no one left inside. Pavlina tried to lunge out of the wardrobe. Bozhena caught her, pressed her close, covered her mouth with her hand. Pavlina struggled, shook, silently, tears running down her face. Bozhena held her tight and didn't breathe herself. The old woman led Mikhey to the chair, set him in it. He sat down limply, like a doll. She stood behind him, began to murmur. The words were impossible to make out, only the rhythm, almost like a song, a very old song. She moved her palms slowly through the air above his head. then placed her hands on his shoulders. And then, what happened next almost made Bozhena lose consciousness right there in the wardrobe. Mikhey began to change. Not suddenly, gradually, as though something was slowly leaving him, something that made him alive. He settled, shrank, color draining from his face, from his hands. The old woman stood behind him with her eyes closed, swaying slightly. Her expression was focused, the way a person looks when doing something routine, something they had done 100 times before. It lasted about a minute, maybe longer. Then the old woman lifted her hands away. Mikhey fell, not fell, slid, from the chair to the floor, slowly, without a sound. And what remained on the floor was clothing, just clothing that had held the shape of a body, and something inside it, something white, almost transparent, like a thin shell. Pavlina, under Bozhena's hand, began to shake with a fine, rapid tremor. The old woman clapped her hands once, sharply. The lamp went out. In the darkness came the creak of the bed. Then silence. Then breathing, loud, uneven, the breathing of a sleeping creature. They waited. How long, Bozhena didn't know. It felt like forever. They sat in the wardrobe, pressed against each other, not moving, barely breathing. Pavlina had long stopped struggling. She just shook and cried silently, tears running and running, and she didn't wipe them, only swallowed sometimes. The breathing from the bed became steadier, deeper, snoring, strange, not human, rasping and heavy, filled the room. Asleep. Bozhena slowly, very slowly, pulled at the wardrobe door. The hinges didn't creak. Lucky. She eased out first, looked around in the darkness. The darkness was almost total. Only in the window, a barely visible gray rectangle of sky. On the bed, a dark mass, motionless, breathing. On the floor, clothing. She took Pavlina's hand, squeezed it, and pulled her along. They moved toward the door 1 centimeter at a time. Every step, infinite care. The foot comes down slowly, rolling from heel to toe, feeling the board before shifting the weight. One board creaked, quietly, barely audible. The breathing from the bed didn't change. Another step, another. The door, the cold latch in her palm. Pull toward you, slowly. The hinges stay quiet. A gap, a little more. Enough to squeeze through. They came out. The night air hit their faces, alive, cold, real. After the staleness of the house, it felt impossible, impossibly clean, impossibly cold, impossibly alive. But they didn't stop. They ran down the porch steps and bolted into the dark forest, holding hands. They ran, not choosing a direction, not thinking, just running, away from the house, away from that bed, away from what was lying on the floor. Branches whipped their faces. Their feet tangled in grass and roots. Once Pavlina fell. Bozhena pulled her up without stopping. Behind them, silence. Only their own footsteps and breathing. No, not only. Something behind them was breathing, heavy, with a wheeze, large, close. Bozhena didn't look back. She knew she mustn't. She just ran. Her feet found the stream before her eyes did. Water burned through her boots with cold. They crossed to the other bank on the stones, ankle deep in ice-cold water. Kept running. The breathing behind them faded. Maybe it stopped at the water. Maybe it fell behind. Bozhena didn't know. She didn't look back. They ran until running became walking, because their legs simply refused to carry them further, because there was no air left, because the body stopped and wouldn't go on. And then metal under Bozhena's hand, cold, rusty, familiar, barbed wire. They'd found it. Found it. They climbed through carefully. The barbs caught their clothing, scratched their hands. Pavlina gave a quiet cry, but they got through. They walked a few dozen more steps and dropped. Just sat down on the ground, right there in the grass, and couldn't get up. Pavlina lost consciousness immediately. Quietly, without a word, she simply fell sideways. Bozhena heard, somewhere far off in the direction of the village, dogs barking. Then another. Then voices, people, calling their names. She tried to call back. Only a rasp came out. She tried to stand. Her legs wouldn't obey. The darkness took her too. She came to herself on the third day. In a hospital. White ceiling. A drip in her hand. The smell of medication. Grandmother sitting beside her. Aged 10 years in those 3 days. Hands folded in her lap. They'd been found 100 meters from the village. Found by hunters who'd been sent out to search that same evening, when the girls hadn't come back for dinner. They'd searched all night. Grandmother didn't say anything about Mikhey straight away. She was quiet for a while, looked out the window, then said quietly, "They didn't find him. They looked. There's nothing." Pavlina had come to herself before Bozhena, physically, but what she said when she did made no sense. The words came in the wrong order. She said unfamiliar names, described places that don't exist. She was transferred to another hospital, a psychiatric one. Grandmother took a long time to say that word out loud. There was an investigation. People came with papers, asked questions, calmly, methodically. Bozhena answered. She said they'd got lost, that they'd been scared, that they couldn't find the way out for a long time. About the house, she said nothing. About what she'd seen in the house, she said nothing. She looked at the people listening to her and understood. If she told the truth, she'd end up where Pavlina was. Mikhey was never found. The investigation was eventually closed. Officially, an accident. A person got lost in unfamiliar terrain. Bozhena was discharged and went back to the city. She never returned to Mordychi. Not that summer, not the next, not ever. Grandmother called, invited her, said she missed her. Bozhena said she was busy, work, later. She didn't explain why she wasn't coming. Grandmother seemed to understand. She didn't push. Pavlina spent a long time in hospital. Then came out, different, quiet, careful, not the reckless girl who used to be first to cross every forbidden line. They met once after, had coffee at a small cafe, talked about nothing, didn't mention the forest, didn't mention Mikhey, just had coffee and went their separate ways. They haven't seen each other since. A year passed, then another. Bozhena lives in the city, works. Everything is fine from the outside. Only sometimes, when you're more tired than usual, or when you stare at one spot for too long, the yellow flicker of that lamp appears. The dark room, the figure in the chair, from which something living slowly drains away. And sometimes, waking in the night, she doesn't immediately understand where she is. She lies there in the dark for a few seconds and listens, not knowing what she's listening for, just listening. It passes. It always passes. She tells herself it always passes. But she won't go back to Mordychi. Never. Because deep inside she knows that creature saw her face. It knows what she looks like. And she doesn't want to wake up one night to find that it came. That's the story. That's exactly how it arrived in my inbox. No name, no signature, just text. At the end, a request to change the names and the location. I did that. Everything else is as it was written. Believe it or not, that's for each person to decide. I won't try to convince you either way. I'll just tell you what I was told. I know one thing. There are places you shouldn't go. There are boundaries you shouldn't cross. Not because of bogs or buried military installations, but because something else is there. Something that was here long before us. Something that has no need of our presence and is not glad of it. And here is what I want to say to you, not as a horror story, but as real advice. First, if local people say you can't go somewhere, don't ask why. Just don't go. People who have lived next to a particular place for decades know things about it that you don't. That knowledge isn't passed through books or the internet. It's passed through experience, through loss. Respect it, even if it seems like superstition. Second, always tell someone where you're going and when you plan to be back. Always. Even if it's just a walk to pick mushrooms for a couple of hours. Especially if it's just for a couple of hours. This isn't paranoia. This is basic caution that can save a life. Third, in an unfamiliar place, don't separate. Never. For no reason. Stay together no matter what. This is one of the most common reasons people don't come back from forests. Fourth, if you feel that something has changed, the air is different, the silence is wrong, time seems to be running strangely, turn around and leave immediately. Don't wait for it to get worse. Intuition in places like that works better than any compass. And the last thing, if something calls your name in a forest you were warned not to enter, don't answer. Even if the voice is familiar, especially if the voice is familiar, but something about it is just slightly off. Take care of yourselves, and take care of those who walk beside you.